Some objects aren't meant to be owned. They possess you long before you realize what's happening. By then, it's already too late. The mask on our wall wasn't just watching us. It was waiting for something. I just wish I had recognized the sign sooner. I first saw it while Laura and I were celebrating our 3rd anniversary in Marrakesh. The narrow alleyways of the souk were a labyrinth of sensory overload. Spices burning my nostrils, merchants calling out prices, fabrics of impossible colors draped across wooden stalls. We had wandered far from the main thoroughfare, following the scent of frankincense down a dimly lit passage when we stumbled upon a shop unlike the others. The elderly shopkeeper barely acknowledged us as we entered. His withered hands continued polishing an ornate dagger, while his milky eyes stared at nothing. The walls were adorned with artifacts from what looked like a dozen different cultures, but one item commanded my attention immediately. Hanging on the back wall was a wooden mask, intricate carvings spiraling from its elongated forehead to its pointed chin. The wood was the color of dried blood, and small shells lined its edge like rotting teeth. Laura touched my arm, suggesting we leave, but I couldn't. Something about the mask's hollow eyes seemed to reflect my own curiosity. When I inquired about its price, the old man finally looked up, his clouded eyes somehow finding mine with unsettling precision. He named a price so low it should have been my first warning. My second warning should have been the way his hands trembled as he wrapped it, refusing to touch the mask directly. Back home in Boston, I mounted it above our fireplace despite Laura's hesitation. She thought it disrupted the room's aesthetic, but I insisted it was a perfect conversation piece. The first night, I dreamt of dense jungle and distant drums, waking with my heart hammering against my ribs and sweat soaking our sheets. I dismissed it as jet lag. 3 days later, I first heard the whispers. I was alone, working late in my home office when the sound drifted down the hallway. A low, continuous murmur like water over stones. The language was nothing I recognized, the cadence unnatural, rising and falling in patterns that made my skin prickle. I convinced myself it was just the pipes or the wind finding new pathways through our old brownstone. But the whispers continued, growing louder each night. Laura claimed she couldn't hear them, watching me with growing concern as I paced the living room at 3 a.m., trying to locate their source. She suggested I see someone about my insomnia. I agreed, not wanting to admit the whispers seemed to stop whenever she entered the room. The handprints appeared exactly 2 weeks after hanging the mask. I discovered the first one while dusting, a perfect outline of a broad palm and splayed fingers on the wall beside the mask. The rusty brown impression looked like dried blood, but flaked away like ordinary dust. Laura insisted it was just discoloration from the aging plaster. I nodded, not mentioning that it hadn't been there the day before. More handprints emerged daily, always radiating outward from the mask. Some were large and powerful, others small and delicate, as though belonging to different individuals. All appeared while we slept or were out of the house. My sleep deteriorated further. The whispers evolved into conversations I almost understood, voices arguing or pleading in that strange language. I began sleeping on the couch beneath the mask, desperate to catch whatever was happening. Laura started staying at her sister's more frequently. She claimed it was to give me space to rest, but I recognized the fear in her eyes when she looked at me. During one of her absences, I caught a glimpse of movement in my peripheral vision. The mask's lips seemed to twitch in a subtle smile. I approached it slowly, heart thundering in my chest. The carved wooden surface remained static under my scrutiny, but something had changed. The mask hung at a slightly different angle, as though someone had adjusted it. My research became obsessive. I contacted anthropologists, linguists, and collectors, sending photos and recordings of the whispers I'd managed to capture. Most dismissed me, but one emeritus professor from Miskatonic University responded with disturbing urgency. He claimed the markings belonged to a pre-colonial Central African cult, whose members believed they could transfer their consciousness into crafted vessels while their bodies died. The masks weren't decorative, but doorways, waiting chambers for displaced souls seeking new hosts. The night after receiving his email, I awoke to find myself standing before the mask, my hand outstretched toward its surface. The air felt electrically charged, and the whispers had become a chorus of urgent voices. My fingertips hovered inches from the wood, drawn forward by an impulse I couldn't name. With horror, I realized I'd been sleepwalking every night, approaching but never quite touching the mask. The handprints now covered almost every inch of wall around the fireplace, some overlapping, others stretching toward the ceiling in impossible positions. Looking closer, I noticed each print had subtle differences in size and shape, dozens of distinct hands reaching out from behind the wall, and in that moment, I understood. The mask wasn't a doorway in, it was a doorway out. I ripped it from the wall and drove to the harbor at dawn. The weight of it seemed to increase with each step toward the water, and the whispers reached a fevered pitch as I stood at the pier's edge. Before I could throw it in, my phone rang. Laura, calling to say she was coming home, that we would work through whatever was happening to me, that she loved me and wouldn't give up. The mask now sits locked in a lead-lined box in our basement storage. Sometimes I still hear faint whispers through the floorboards, but they're weaker now, more distant. Laura and I are seeing a counselor who believes my episodes were manifestations of work stress and unprocessed trauma. Maybe she's right. But I still check my hands against the prints I photographed before repainting our walls. I measure my fingers against their outline, reassuring myself they don't match. And sometimes when I catch my reflection in the mirror, I pause, just for a moment, to make sure the face looking back is truly mine. The whispers started the moment Sarah brought that book into our home. They crawled through the walls at night, scratching at the edges of my consciousness. I'd wake up drenched in cold sweat, convinced someone or something was watching me from the darkest corner of our bedroom. That's when I knew the book was more than just an old collection of stories. It was waiting for something, for us. My wife found it while cleaning out her grandmother's attic after the old woman moved to assisted living, an ancient, leather-bound book with faded gilt lettering that simply read Bedtime Tales. Sarah thought it charming, a piece of her childhood she could reconnect with. I thought nothing of it until the nightmares began. The first night I awoke to Sarah's thrashing beside me. Her breathing was shallow and rapid, her forehead slick with perspiration. When morning came, she described a vivid nightmare about a forest path that twisted and turned, leading deeper into darkness, where something waited. I brushed it off as coincidence when she mentioned it matched the story she'd read before bed. Then she showed me the book. The page after the story she'd read was blank the night before. Now it contained detailed illustrations and text that hadn't been there previously. Descriptions of a woman lost in that same forest, the trees bending toward her with gnarled, finger-like branches. Sarah's face went pale as she pointed out details from her nightmare that now appeared on the page. My rational mind sought explanations. Perhaps she'd overlooked the page. Maybe this was her grandmother's idea of a joke, using invisible ink that appeared over time. I suggested we put the book away, but curiosity got the better of Sarah. That night, against my protests, she read the next story, about a mirror that showed reflections that moved independently of their owners. My skin prickled as she read, the temperature in our bedroom seeming to drop with each word. I refused to listen, burying myself in work until exhaustion claimed me around 3 a.m. The nightmare seized me instantly. I stood before an antique mirror, but my reflection remained still while I moved. Then it smiled, a grotesque, impossibly wide smile that split its face. Blood seeped from the corners of its eyes as it pressed its hands against the glass, pushing outward. I woke up screaming, my heart hammering against my ribs like it might break free. Sarah was already awake, her eyes wide with terror. She didn't need to tell me she'd experienced the same nightmare. The tremor in her hand said everything as she reached for the book on her nightstand. The next page, previously blank, now showed a man and woman sleeping in a bed identical to ours, while their reflections climbed out of a mirror on the opposite wall, creeping toward the sleeping figures with elongated fingers. My throat constricted, making it difficult to swallow. The sweat that coated my body turned icy as I stared at our bedroom, rendered in perfect detail, right down to the crack in the ceiling and the pattern on our comforter. The artist couldn't have known these things. No one could have. I seized the book and locked it in the trunk of my car. When I returned to the house, Sarah was sitting motionless at the kitchen table. Her vacant expression sent shudders down my spine as she informed me, in a monotone voice, that she'd called her grandmother. According to the old woman, the book had been in the family for generations, always finding its way back into the house, regardless of attempts to discard it. That night, despite my certainty that the book remained locked in my car, I found it on Sarah's nightstand when I emerged from the shower. The pages rustled softly in a non-existent breeze. Sarah's gaze was transfixed on it, her pupils dilated, her breathing shallow. When I asked how it got there, she claimed ignorance, but something in her voice sounded hollow, like an echo in an empty room. I took the book and drove to a construction site across town, burying it deep in wet concrete being poured for a foundation. My hands shook violently as I drove home, constantly checking the rearview mirror, unable to shake the sensation of being followed. Sleep eluded me that night. Every creak of the house settling sent spasms of terror through my body. My mouth turned to sandpaper, my muscles coiled tight enough to snap. Around 2 a.m., I heard Sarah get up. Through slitted eyes, I watched her walk to her nightstand with an unnatural, fluid grace that didn't belong to her. The book sat there, exactly where it had always been, as if my desperate disposal attempt had never happened. In the gray light of dawn, I examined the book while Sarah slept. The next page was no longer blank. It showed a man, my face rendered with unsettling accuracy, desperately trying to destroy a book. With each attempt, the book reappeared, and the man's features gradually transformed into something inhuman. The final illustration showed the man opening the book to its last page, his expression a mask of abject horror, as he realized too late that the stories were never meant to be read to completion. I slammed the book shut, my vision swimming as a wave of vertigo washed over me. The room felt suddenly vast and distorted, the corners stretching into impossible darkness. My perception warped as shadows deepened where they shouldn't, forming shapes that moved when I looked away. One page remains unread, one nightmare yet to unfold. I can feel the book calling to me from where I've hidden it behind the loose baseboard in my office. My fingers itch to touch its ancient leather binding again. Part of me knows I should resist, burn it, bury it, anything. But the other part, the growing part, whispers that I'll never be free until I read the final page. The boundary between what's real and what's story has worn dangerously thin. Sometimes, when I glance at my hands, I swear I can see through them to the page below. I fear that we aren't reading the book at all. The book is reading us. Some places aren't meant to be found. Some doors aren't meant to be opened. I know this now, after what happened in those woods. The memory sits like ice in my veins, a permanent reminder that there are things lurking in the shadows that defy explanation, things that know us better than we know ourselves. I had convinced my cousin David to go hiking through the Black Ridge Forest. We both needed an escape from our stifling jobs and the monotony of city life. The trail was supposed to be straightforward, a 6-hour trek ending at a waterfall that would make for the perfect camping spot. I'd studied the map diligently, memorized the landmarks, packed all the essentials. But nature has a way of unraveling even the most carefully laid plans. The fog rolled in 3 hours into our hike. It came without warning, thick and disorienting, swallowing the trail markers and turning familiar terrain into an alien landscape. The temperature dropped suddenly, and my breath formed small clouds in front of my face. David suggested turning back, but I was certain we could push through. That was my first mistake. By dusk, we were hopelessly lost. The setting sun cast long shadows through the trees, transforming them into twisted sentinels watching our every move. My phone had no signal, and the compass spun erratically, as if the magnetic field itself was disturbed. A sense of dread settled over me, that peculiar feeling of being observed from just beyond the periphery of vision. Every snapping twig and rustling leaf sent jolts of adrenaline through my system. That's when we stumbled upon the cabin. It stood in a small clearing, weathered gray planks, barely visible in the fading light. A single window reflected the dying sun like a baleful eye. The door was secured with a heavy padlock that looked oddly new compared to the decrepit structure. Something about the cabin felt wrong. It appeared abandoned, yet maintained in some essential way. I felt a strong urge to leave immediately, but the darkening sky and dropping temperature made the decision for us. We set up our tent nearby, close enough to use the cabin's walls as a windbreak, but far enough away to calm the inexplicable anxiety it provoked in me. I convinced myself it was just the stress of being lost, but deep down, I knew better. Sleep came fitfully. I tossed and turned in my sleeping bag, plagued by dreams of running through endless woods. Around midnight, a sound tore me from uneasy slumber, a soft scraping against the cabin door. My heart hammered against my ribs as I strained to listen. David was still asleep, his breathing deep and regular. The scraping stopped, replaced by the unmistakable sound of metal on metal, the padlock being manipulated. My mouth went dry. I wanted to wake David but found myself paralyzed, trapped between fear and disbelief. Then came a voice, soft and melodic, calling out into the night. "Michael, come out, Michael. I've been waiting for you." My blood turned to ice. It wasn't just that someone was out there. It was that they knew my name. And not just my name, but the name only my family used. Michael, not Mike. The formal version only used at family gatherings and in childhood. "Your grandfather sends his regards, Michael. And little Davy, too. Come see what I have to show you both." Sweat beaded on my forehead despite the cold. My grandfather had died 15 years ago, and little Davy, that nickname had been abandoned when we were teenagers, known only to immediate family. I reached over and shook David frantically, clasping my hand over his mouth before he could speak. His eyes widened in alarm as I gestured for silence. The voice continued, softer now, almost a whisper. I know about the fishing trip, Michael, about the boat and the storm, about the promise you made. A tremor ran through my body. The fishing trip was a closely guarded secret, a childhood incident when David and I had nearly drowned after taking my grandfather's boat out during a storm. We'd promised each other never to speak of it, terrified of the punishment that would follow. No one knew. No one could know. We huddled in frozen terror as footsteps circled our tent. The canvas walls seemed suddenly thin and insubstantial. A silhouette appeared, impossibly tall and gaunt, moving with unnatural fluidity. The shadow paused at the tent entrance, and I could make out the outline of a hand reaching for the zipper. My heart pounded so loudly, I was certain it could be heard. I clutched my pocket knife, the only weapon we had. The zipper moved an inch, then stopped. The figure remained motionless for what felt like eternity, before withdrawing into the darkness. We stayed awake until dawn, trembling and speechless, communicating only in glances and gestures. Morning brought an eerie silence. No birds sang, no insects buzzed. We emerged from the tent cautiously, muscles aching from tension. The first thing I noticed was the cabin door, now standing ajar, the padlock lying open on the ground. David pointed wordlessly to a set of footprints leading from our tent to the cabin door, then continuing into the woods. The prints were oddly spaced and too deep, as if made by someone unnaturally heavy. They stopped abruptly 20 yards away, as if whoever or whatever had made them had simply vanished into thin air. Against my better judgment, I approached the cabin. The door creaked open at my touch, revealing nothing but bare walls and dusty floorboards. No furniture, no signs of habitation, just a single photograph nailed to the far wall, faded and yellowed with age. I stepped closer, my legs nearly giving way beneath me as recognition dawned. It was a picture of David and me as children, standing proudly beside my grandfather's boat. A picture that had been lost years ago, on the day of the storm. On the back, written in faint, spidery handwriting, were the words, "See you next time." We found our way back to the trail within hours, as if the forest had decided to release us. Neither of us has spoken about what happened, but I know David feels it too. The certainty that we didn't escape, we were let go. And sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I hear that soft, melodic voice calling my name, reminding me that promises made in the woods are never truly forgotten.